Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, souls, debt slaves, serfs, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And we have to keep our eye on the insanity of the U.S. and the West. The focal point is Ukraine, of course. But what's going on now that keeps pushing us closer to global disaster? And I put it on the West. And I know that's not a popular narrative right now because the statist narrative that's out there is about Putin and his evil empire and how crazy he is. And we're out there defending democracy, and we have to fight Russian expansion and all of that. But of course, like everything else in the statist narratives, it's all a complete lie. One of the biggest lies, and one of the things that's a catalyst for what we see now, is this utter ridiculous lie that Putin is going to go into Ukraine and then he has ambitions to invade Europe, take over the Baltic states and Poland and everything else. And it's just simply not true. Putin has made that very clear. As he stated, they have plenty of land. And just the idea that he wants to reconstruct the Soviet Union and then invade Europe is so preposterous. I can't believe anybody would believe it, even the bewildered herd out there that has no idea. So they just buy into the statist narrative that we hear from our politicians and the politicians in Europe and NATO, as well as the UN. And so a little background information. A lot of this started because when the Soviet Union broke up, they had occupied a lot of the Eastern European countries, and it was called the Warsaw Pact. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of these states became free again. And then there was a tacit agreement between the Russians and the U.S. that the NATO alliance wouldn't absorb all those countries and then have NATO and the Western powers presence right on Russia's border. And that was a most reasonable request. And of course, the U.S. violated that agreement. They not only took all those countries back into Europe, but one by one, every single one of them became a member of NATO. And the biggest one, of course, and the line in the sand for Putin was Ukraine. Ukraine was at the very heart of Russian culture. It's a major state in that area. And having Ukraine absorbed into NATO, and there's been a lot of discussion about bringing Ukraine into NATO. Bringing Ukraine into NATO would put potentially nuclear weapons and large military forces right on Russia's border. Putin has every reason to not want to go there with that. And let's be reminded too, with the addition of all these Eastern European countries into the NATO alliance, we have ostensibly an encirclement of Russia. There's military forces and military bases and Western bases basically all over Europe, and then also in the underside of Russia as well. And then, of course, the U.S. has a presence in Southeast Asia as well. And so basically Russia's encircled. So the idea that the U.S. is threatened by Russia, once again, is preposterous. And it also brings up the fact that, you know, the U.S. has contingency plans and has stated in the open that their ultimate goal is the dismemberment of Russia into smaller states and have regime change. So the U.S. will be pushing for the further collapse of Russia and then create regional zones all throughout Russia. And and they have maps. They have maps that are available to the public, and you can see what the U.S. and the West envisions for Russia, a bunch of rump states that they can easily exploit, particularly for resources. And one of the interesting historical factors about this too is when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation was born, Russia offered to join NATO, to be part of NATO and be a collective alliance with the West to protect interests in the region. And of course, there was no interest in doing that. And so NATO continues to be not really a force to protect Europe. It's a force to attack Russia, and Putin is absolutely right in that characterization of it. And I also find it interesting too that there was almost a war started in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when John Kennedy was president, and it was because Russia had started building missile launching pads in Cuba, and we almost came to nuclear war over that. But here we are, fast forward to the future, and Russia is surrounded by American and Western missiles right on their borders. And the irony is not lost on me. It certainly is lost on so many foreign policy experts. But so we're outraged that Russia had, or Soviet Union at that time, had missiles in Cuba right on our border, in one small island and a few installations, and yet the Russian Federation right now is surrounded by thousands of missile installations right on their border. So totally hypocritical. And then if you look at the history, once again, this isn't part of the status narrative and what's being pushed by politicians and the media, and this is what's unfortunately in the heads of most Americans. But the fact is, this is not Putin's war. He didn't want it, and he didn't ask for it. And a good example of that is the U.S., as we now know from documentation, was behind the coup in Ukraine, and a Western puppet government was installed, including now this insane megalomaniac dictator Zelensky. And Zelensky is, once again, as we know from documentation and phone calls that have been released to the public, he was set up as a puppet for the West. He was installed by the West. I think Victoria Nuland was involved in those phone calls. And then to take it to the next step, so the coup happened. So now all of a sudden, Russia has a very unfriendly nation on their border. But then Ukraine begins attacking the Donbass region and all those countries in the eastern part of Ukraine. And these are all regions that are mostly Russian. They're Russian speaking, they have Russian traditions, they have Russian churches. And the Ukrainians, as soon as the puppet government was installed, and in spite of referendums that all of these Russian speaking areas wanted to become federated republics added back to Russia, Ukraine bombed them. So there was initially there was quite a conflict there, and then it kind of went away from the news, but it never ended. So people aren't aware that for 8 years, Ukraine mercilessly attacked and bombed all these breakaway regions in that part of Ukraine. And so it's actually amazing to me that Putin was so patient, and he waited 8 years to go in there and protect Russian people. And he had every right to do so. So to call this an unprovoked, vicious attack on a sovereign country is just a gross characterization of it. And the same also goes for Crimea. Crimea was basically given to the Ukraine, I believe in the 50s, but it could be the 60s. And the Crimea region was given to Ukraine and is the seat of the Russian fleet, port for the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. So they were only actually somewhat recently given the area of Crimea. Once again, Crimea had a referendum. So when all this is going on, Crimea had a referendum, and well over 90% of the people in Crimea wanted to rejoin Russia and join the Federated Union, be a federal state in the Russian Federation. So this whole idea that somehow Russia just annexed Crimea and it was a crime and unjust and unfair and more Putin madness is once again just entirely insane characterization. I would also add that I was actually surprised when Putin actually did finally invade Ukraine, and once again in the media and the politicians, they tried to characterize it like Putin wants to take over the whole country of Russia, of Ukraine, and annex again. And that's just not true. He went in there and he's trying to disable Ukraine's ability to attack the Donbass region and all the breakaway regions, and he had to take extreme measures because the offensive capabilities of Ukraine against those regions was so vast. So he had no choice really than to extend what he calls a military operation even further. Now, let's remember too that, you know, Putin characterizing this as a special military operation is not unusual at all. The U.S. when they go into Afghanistan, the U.S. when they go into Iraq, they characterize those as special military operations. So they can bypass Congress a lot of times because in order to declare war, you have to go through Congress. But to have a special military operation is a way to circumvent that. And this this I this continuing arming of Ukraine by the U.S. and NATO, sure, it's going to antagonize Russia. And now we're at the point where is in the media right now that we're not only supplying Ukraine with the capability and the weapons, but we're in public saying, oh, don't use those to attack Russia. And the day after they get these weapons, they get a green light behind closed doors, and they want to attack places within Russia. More antagonism of Russia. And like I pointed out before, I have no illusions about Putin. I have no illusions about Russia. They have a lot of problems that a lot of countries have. But the fact is, he's been very patient. And that recent so-called terrorist attack at the theater in Russia, where so many people were killed, you know, we find out those are Ukrainian agents that did it. It was all set up by Ukraine. And so, you know, once again, there was a massive terrorist attack in the U.S. or anywhere else in the globe, and they found Ukrainian connections, we'd probably be going to war with Ukraine. So we're seeing an increasing scale and types of weapons being given to Ukraine, and it's not going to do any good. They're so outgunned, they're so outgunned in technology, and they're so outgunned in possibilities to keep sustaining this war that it's already a done deal. That's one of the tragic things about this. The war's already over. Ukraine has already lost. There's just this desperation going on, and the continued slaughter of Ukrainians is totally useless. And once again, it bolsters what I've said about elites. They don't care. All the rich elites in Ukraine, first of all, anybody that could avoid conscription could buy their way out early on. So they got the fuck out of Dodge. And then, of course, all the rich that stay there, they're completely insulated from it. And it's to the point now where Ukraine is trying to gather up all the people that left Ukraine and get them out there out in the trenches. I can assure you, none of the oligarchs and Zelensky's families out there fighting this. And it's also tragic to watch stories coming out of the kind of people. The average age of somebody in the Ukrainian army right now is 43. That's the average age. So you got 60-year-olds probably out there. And I've also seen clips where they're actually rounding up the mentally disabled and the physically disabled and putting them out in the trenches. And they're also sending vans all over Ukraine to just pick up whoever they can, drunks, stragglers, mentally ill, disabled, anybody they can find, and then press them into the Ukraine army. So this is a tragic episode on epic proportions. And it really makes me angry that we have all this virtue signaling in the UK. You know, you go on Facebook and everybody's got their little Ukrainian flags, and they're completely ignorant of the history that led up to this. And they're completely ignorant of the actual historical and current narrative of what's going on. It just adds to the tragedy. I recently read a quote, I believe it was no, it wasn't Aldous Huxley, but it said that the problem isn't the liars. We all know all these politicians are liars. The real problem is the people that believe these liars. And this is a situation that completely exemplifies that. So what do we have now? We have the U.S. and the Western powers facilitating Ukraine, putting more and more weapons in there that they're just immediately destroyed. For example, we're throwing in hundreds, if not thousands, of tanks from Europe and the U.S. And we're finding out that they're obsolete. They're obsolete on the battlefield now. The technology is to the point where they immediately get destroyed. They're so easy to target and to kill. And the same thing goes with the infantry. You know, they're practically using World War I tactics and trench warfare there. And if the Russian military can target them, all they have to do is look for flashpoints from their weapons. They're immediately targeted, and they're slaughtered. And like I pointed out, we're going to probably see more of this, these attempts to have terrorist attacks backed by the Ukraine striking in Russia. And as I said over and over, Putin has every right to be outraged by that. Any other country certainly would be. And then we're getting, you know, the West and the U.S. are getting in deeper, deeper, deeper because we're supplying technical support. We're supplying satellite targeting. We're supplying intelligence. And now, you know, there's talk about more and more advisors going in there, and that, of course, is mission creep. That's how the Vietnam War started for the U.S. You know, we said we're sending in advisors, and it turns out we're just sending military in there, and it just builds up and builds up. You know, pretty soon, a lot of these Western forces and advisors and everything else that are in Ukraine are going to be targets, and Putin has said that they will be targets. And that's not to mention the fact that not only do we have large numbers of mercenaries fighting for Ukraine, but the spooks are already there too. Special forces from all the NATO countries in the U.S. are already operating in there. There are boots in the ground, I assure you. We find that out every time. Syria was a good example. President Obama kept promising that, oh, there's no boots on the ground, there's new boots on the ground. And then after the story dies from the media, we find out the country of Syria is lousy with them. Now, you know, people are completely oblivious to what's going on in Syria. Now we have U.S. troops there occupying a third of the country and confiscating their oil. And so the rhetoric is really getting heated now. All these NATO countries keep going back and forth. Their leaders, one moment will come out and say, well, we're going to send troops into Ukraine. The next minute say, no, well, no, we're not. And the U.S. is doing that as well. But these NATO threats of increasing sophisticated technology and sending Western troops in there, naturally it's just going to antagonize Putin. So on the surface, in the media and the politicians are out there saying, oh yeah, we want peace, we want to defend democracy and brave Ukraine, those evil Russians, and that's not what's happening at all, but the fact that they're using all this rhetoric. And then they demonize Putin for his rhetoric, you know, Putin talking about nuclear weapons and pushing him too far. And that's a natural reaction. By any country would do that. And he's merely responding to the heated rhetoric and the insanity and the threats that are coming from the West. And once again, it's okay for the U.S. to use long-range weapons to strike in Russia. Russia's been very restrained. I mean, I know it's a slaughter over there, and there's a massive amount of technology and troops involved, but Russia basically is trying to maintain just its goals. They would like this war to end. And in fact, Putin came out recently and said, you know, we could stop this war today. All you have to do, stop the war, let these Russian regions become federated states in Russia, and the war's over. It's just that simple. Sooner or later, Zelensky's going to have to give up that territory. It's the only solution. And the longer he keeps this on, the more Ukraine is going to just be a failed state with generations slaughtered in the field for nothing. And, you know, as I pointed out in so many other videos, it's all about money. Because what's happening is all the transnationals and all the banks, they're lining up to have a cash cow after the failure of Ukraine. And they're going to make bank off of reconstructing the company, and big hedge funds like Blackstone and the like, and BlackRock are already signed contracts for the reconstruction of Ukraine afterwards. And of course, the other thing we know what's going to happen is, you know, when the Ukraine originally collapsed, as it were, all the oligarchs went in there and bought up what all used to be state assets and became richer than shit. And they bought it for pennies on the dollar. So then you have the oligarch class. Well, that's going to happen again, because when Ukraine collapses, all the Western transnationals, all the big players, the hedge funds and the banks, they're going to go into Ukraine and they're going to confiscate and get all these assets and resources for pennies on the dollar. So that's the ultimate game. I mean, the other ultimate game is this is a proxy war between Russia and the United States, because the United States decided somehow to start demonizing Russia again, and they were our friend. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, they wanted nothing more to be friends with us, and we turned their back on them because the U.S. doesn't want partners, they want vassal states. And the fact that Russia confronts the American empire and doesn't want to be a vassal state speaks well of them. And so things continue to escalate more too, because we have Ukraine with Western U.S. technology. They're attacking radar stations and nuclear warning systems. And that's very ominous, because if they're trying to create channels by which Western weapons can more penetrate Russian airspace and hit the interior of Russia, that's just going to escalate further. And so the fact that we have this situation and the rhetoric gets more and more heated from the West, I assure you, Putin is the sane person at the table. The people in the West and Europe and the U.S. are the ones who are insane. And the fact that they have the audacity, the narcissism, the psychopathic narcissism to push the entire globe to a possible nuclear disaster because of their egos and their greed for money, and to watch the just endless, pointless slaughter of all these Ukrainians, it's just heartbreaking. And if it ends in this ultimate tragedy, and I would add another thing, what we've been taught from history is the fact that even though on the surface they tout the strength of Western economies, it's got cracks all over it. The foundation is rotten, and there's so much debt piled up, and it's debt that will not be paid. And a lot of times these countries, and this is historically proven, war after war, they want to cover up the collapse of the economic system by having a big, huge war that not only distracts everyone, but then they don't have to pay the piper with the economic destruction that's already baked in the cake in the West and the United States. So anyway, I'm not a religious man, but fucking God help us.